History as it happens, June 8th, 2021. Understanding racism.
We can't just choose to learn what we want to know and not what we should know. We should know the good, the bad, everything. That's what great nations do.
The 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre was a reminder of what we've forgotten and what we struggle to reckon with. A history of slavery, Jim Crow, and more. And it seems our divisions are growing deeper as we fight over what we should teach our kids about this relevant past. Is it possible to confront our history without making enemies of one another? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
When they were sitting at those lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream and seeking to take the whole nation back to those great wells of democracy.
We're not brutalized because we're Methodists. We're not brutalized because we're Muslims. We're not brutalized because we're Catholics. We're brutalized because we are black people in America.
There's a word we've been hearing a lot lately: reckoning. We're having a reckoning with our past, a reckoning with police misconduct and centuries of racial discrimination. Think about all the attention paid to the issue of race over the past year or so, since the murder of George Floyd. Thousands of news articles, hours of talk shows, new books on the bestseller list, private companies, Hollywood, you name it, publicly pledging to commit to diversity. And there was all that public shaming, too. Some would say virtue signaling on social media. Did all of that bring us closer to truly understanding our past and each other? Or is our society just sinking deeper into racial acrimony? I mean, look at all the states right now trying to ban the teaching of critical race theory in schools because it supposedly teaches young people to hate their country, as the opponents say.
Let me be clear. There's no room in our classrooms for things like critical race theory. Teaching kids to hate their country and to hate each other is not worth 1 red cent of taxpayer money.
And that was Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Now, for an opposing view, you might want to listen to Hannibal Johnson. He is the chair of the Education Committee for the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission. He wrote in the New York Times, "Learning this history is necessary if we are to advance toward racial reconciliation. But it is not sufficient." He goes on to say, "We also must build trust across racial groups. In Tulsa, trust was among the casualties of the massacre, and restoring it remains difficult and is ongoing. But it is possible," writes Hannibal Johnson. Well, I hope so, but I don't know. These issues have been festering for generations, and people have been demanding solutions for decades. In 1969, James Baldwin appeared on The Dick Cavett Show, and it was a remarkable interview. Baldwin explained why many black people did not celebrate American history as whites did not view or remember the country the same way. He was trying to explain the chasm in outlook. And just a heads up here, Baldwin uses the N-word in this clip, but I left it in. It would have been wrong to sanitize his words.
You know, when the Israelis pick up guns, or the Poles, or the Irish, or any white man in the world says, "Give me liberty or give me death," the entire white world applauds. When a black man says exactly the same thing, word for word, he is judged a criminal and treated like one, and everything possible is done to make an example of this bad nigger so there won't be any more like him. Now, you can do this if you like, you know, until your party is over. But I know, after all, who my heroes are. And George Washington is not one of my heroes, for example. Neither is Booker T. Washington. What the American public has always tried to do is to accommodate me into a system which is always meant my death.
What Baldwin was basically saying there, at least how I interpreted his words, was the way white people and black people experience the United States totally different. I mean, just think about how something like the Tulsa Massacre could be forgotten. Why movies like Gone with the Wind have such a profound influence on the way we remember the Civil War.
Fits when they took all us freelands to dig the ditch for the white soldiers to hide in. But Jamal said the Confederates needs it. So we's going to dig for the South. Goodbye, Miss Scarlett. Don't worry. We'll stop them Yankees. Goodbye, Miss Scarlett. Goodbye.
If you didn't remember that scene, it's one of Scarlett O'Hara's old slaves, whose name is Pork, proudly, happily marching off to help the Confederacy win the war. As I often say on this podcast, these stories matter. Origin stories define our past and our present selves. People feel their dignity as citizens, as humans, is at stake when we decide which parts of our past are worth remembering, worth teaching our kids. So let's have a conversation about this now with Leslie Harris. She's a historian at Northwestern University, specializing in African American studies, and is the author of Slavery and the University, Histories and Legacies. Leslie Harris, welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.
We're honored to have you. So let's start with the big question. As a scholar of African American history, why do you believe it's so difficult just to raise this issue, the ugly parts of our past?
Well, it's funny. I don't think of history as ugly or pretty, but I know that many people find talking about the more difficult parts of our past difficult. I do think some histories are more difficult to come to terms with, and we're clearly in a moment right now when that's true. There are elements of our history that reflect the human condition, past, present, and future. And I think it's really necessary to understand the ways that people were divided in the past, because they can tell us a lot about what we're dealing with now. And we can look at the ways people dealt with those divisions: slavery, racism, racial hierarchies, warfare, economic inequality. These are all ongoing parts of the human condition. We do often look at ugly parts of our past, as you put it. We can think of World War II, for example. Certainly the Holocaust was a very troublesome part of our past, and we are still struggling with what genocide means for Nazi Germany, but also for other parts of the world. But in the US, we have had a difficult time talking about racism, particularly racism and slavery, dealing with African Americans. And I think for some people, it's an unpleasant topic, or they think that they will be forced to apologize for something. As an historian, my goal and my role is to try as best I can to talk about the past, to research it, to put it out there, and then to let people come to their own conclusions about it, about what it means for the present and our future.
Well, we're seeing a backlash across the country when it comes to this issue, teaching about slavery and racism in schools, what to teach children about the historic treatment of African Americans in our country. Does that backlash, well, it must concern you. I was going to ask you if it concerns you. It must.
It does. The backlash does concern me. I think it makes people more uncomfortable than they need to be about discussing these issues. One of the things, when I was at Emory as a professor of history, I founded an organization called the Transforming Community Project. And we studied history as a way to then think about current day events that were happening. History can be a place where we look at how our ancestors, quite literally our ancestors, dealt with some of the same issues that we're dealing with today. Of course, not exactly the same, but very similar. And for me, studying history is a way sometimes to think through similar things. So one of my favorite groups of people are the radical abolitionists of the 19th century. So these are whites and African Americans who come together to try to end slavery and overcome racism as well. And they weren't perfect. They tried lots of things. They did lots of things. Some things worked, some things didn't. They disagreed, but they stayed together, fighting what they saw as twin evils for several decades. And I think looking at their example can give us some clues on how to mount successful efforts to change and improve our society. So that's a very positive aspect. The second thing about studying history and studying the history of racism and of slavery is it allows us to see why African Americans, some African Americans, are still in a very difficult position in our society today. that we have legacies. We have all kinds of legacies from the past. We have the legacies of our American ideals, of course, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. We also have negative legacies. And without looking at those negative legacies as well, we really can't understand why we're failing. And we can't improve. We really have to take on some of the negative legacies and think about deeply, is there a way to change them? Can we redress them? Some people don't like the word reparations. They assume it means a check. Reparations is rooted for me in the term repair. Is there a way to repair some of these events of the past that have held groups back, have held individuals back? And how do we do that? How do we move forward towards some of the ideals that were part of the founding documents? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, equality, that all men are created equal, which of course they use the term men, meaning all people are created equal. At the time, they had not yet lived into that ideal. And we can talk about why that was and use that as a marker for our own efforts to live up to that ideal.
To your point as to why this history is relevant, I'll just pull up one headline that appeared in a newspaper recently. A windfall for minority farmers divides rural America. It's about a $4 billion federal fund that is designed under the Biden administration to confront, reading from the article, how racial injustice has shaped American farming, but has angered white farmers who say they are being unfairly excluded. But the point of the program is to help black farmers who were excluded for generations beforehand. Unfortunately, not everyone sees it that way. It is causing tensions in those communities. And the fear is we're not going to get anywhere here.
I think that the arguments about programs like this are rooted in this idea that we don't have enough as a nation. So right now, we're in a contradictory set of rhetorics. We're the best nation, we're the wealthiest nation in the world, we're the greatest nation on the one hand. On the other hand, we don't have enough to take care of everyone in the nation. And I don't believe the latter. I think we have enough. So that's one place that I would start. The second place, though, is the fact that this redress is rooted in what has happened in the past. And one thing I saw in that article that interested me was the fact that in 1920, African Americans owned 14% of farms in the US. And quoting from the article, after a century of racial violence, foreclosures, and migration, they represented 1.4% of African American farmers. And even recently, in the post-1965 moment, after the Civil Rights Acts were passed, we know that Black farmers did not have access to federal funding and support at the same rate that white farmers did. Now, do we have enough money to support all of our farmers? I would say yes. Do we have enough money to try to make up some of the ground that was lost by Black farmers? I would say yes. And so we, as a nation, politicians, our government, have to speak differently about what I would call the commonwealth, the wealth that this nation, that all of us hold in common, how it has been unevenly shared, and how can we make that more equitable, that sharing, that access. 1.4% of American farmers are Black. That's pennies. It almost sounds like a rounding error. And if white farmers, the other percentage, which I'm assuming there are other racial groups as well involved in the 90%.
I'm not good at math either.
Me either. So, but if those farmers are suffering, we need to address that. But that doesn't mean that we can't address what has been a much longer term problem with Black farmers in this case.
Yeah, rooted in history.
And if we were to go back to the Civil War era even, we are a group of people who worked these farms without pay. After slavery ended, there was suggestion that Black people be given recompense for their unpaid labor by being given land. But in fact, that never happened. So in a way, this is a small price to pay at this point. We're talking about a tiny number of people. But the broader question is, can we have a different conversation about the commonwealth of the nation? How it advantages everyone if everyone feels that they have what they need to survive and thrive.
Well, whenever I hear someone say they want to move on from these matters or they don't want to dwell on the past, we know that the past still means something to them when they object, for instance, to a city or town trying to remove Confederate monuments, as we saw last summer. And I thought that was a mark of progress when Richmond, Virginia, to name one, finally took down those towering statues for the Confederacy, because they weren't put up to honor fallen heroes of Civil War battlefields. We know they were put up long after the war for other reasons.
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at the dates on when many of these Confederate monuments were founded, they are actually built almost 50 years, sometimes much more, after the Civil War. They are often erected during a period of time when there's an uptick, a huge uptick in racial violence across the nation. We can even look at where some of these monuments are positioned: on the courthouse lawns, in the town square, on the grounds of state legislatures. These monuments to the Confederacy, these white soldiers, often armed, are put there as a warning to African Americans that these are not places for you to achieve equality. These are places where you will not get justice for crimes against you. You will also not have equality of voting. The time period in which these Confederate monuments are erected is also the Jim Crow era, where African Americans are losing businesses, they're losing land, and they're losing the right to vote by both legal means and illegal means. Mob violence, voting restrictions such as literacy laws and poll taxes, and other means. And having that kind of monument on a courthouse lawn indicates that if those Black people bring charges against the people who committed this violence, they were not likely to receive justice. So these monuments really mark off public land, public government as something that is not for Black people, but is for white people. It is for Black people as punishment, but not as a place at which to receive justice.
They were weapons in the culture war of their day, as you just explained. They were a statement about history, the myth of the lost cause, which whitewashed, pardon the pun, the causes of the Civil War.
Absolutely, there's definitely a culture war going on, but I would also say there's an actual war, and it is one in which whites in the South in particular, but also in other parts of the nation, are seeking to control Black labor, are seeking to prevent Blacks from seizing political power. This is in the aftermath of the Reconstruction era, where that era is still the period of time in which the most people of African descent are elected to office, from sheriffs all the way up through state legislatures. And once Reconstruction ends in 1877, Southern whites use violence to strip Black people of political possibilities, often of land. They try to return them to farms as sharecroppers. And so these Confederate monuments are a monument as much to that reclaiming of white power of public space as they are to the Confederacy, to the Civil War, even to slavery. This is really a marker of a new kind of power, and they're expressing it publicly in a way that is set to reinforce white supremacy. And who is in control here?
Thousands of Black people were lynched in the United States over the course of several decades, and I'm not sure anyone was ever prosecuted and sentenced for any of those murders. So I sense that when we see, for instance, episodes of police brutality today, that history resonates.
One thing we have to understand about lynching in that time period is that people who lynched African Americans, whites, were not necessarily disconnected from the judicial system or from the police system. These people were intertwined. Members of the Klan could also be the sheriff or police officers in the town. The other thing is that if people were, as you mentioned, if people were brought to trial, they were rarely, if ever, convicted of those murders. And so you really have a whole justice system that is set up to protect the murderers and not the people who were victims of these murders. So there definitely, to me, is a link between the police brutality that we see today and lynching of people then. I would also say, though, that alongside lynching, which we think of as extra legal, as something committed outside of the criminal justice system or outside of the justice system, but you still have disproportionate numbers of Black people who are tried and convicted of crimes. We have, the whole system of capital punishment at that time. We also have convict labor and convict lease. For relatively minor crimes, African Americans could be convicted, brought to prison, and then leased out as laborers to Southern industries, to individuals, et cetera. And that goes on for several decades after Reconstruction as well. Now we have, of course, a continuation of this kind of police brutality, but that, as you said, is a continuing strain from that time period.
I believe the convict lease system that you just alluded to didn't end until the 1940s, right?
That's right. It was ended under the law. I believe there was a Supreme Court case that decided that. So it did end, but it did go on quite late. I will be remiss, though, in not mentioning that there are still, of course, laborers in our prison system today. That labor within prisons continues to this day, and payment is literally pennies per hour.
I mentioned the culture wars before. Do you believe that sometimes we can take this too far? For instance, I'm all for getting rid of Confederate generals. As a Yankee, I was born in New York City, so when I moved down here to Washington, D.C., which I suppose is the South, I was puzzled at over the border in Virginia to see boulevards named after traitors. But not to digress. But when it comes to taking Abraham Lincoln's name off a school in San Francisco, isn't that going too far?
Well, so this is the question I have, which is about who do we name and why do we name? So Lincoln, I think, is a perfect example of the complicated politics of naming. So is it an honor or can we name someone as a commemoration? Lincoln, to me, is this very complicated figure. Before he's elected president, he runs on a platform that is anti-slavery, but he tries to straddle anti-slavery and racism. He doesn't want to frighten away potential voters north and south. So one of the things from the Lincoln-Douglas debates that I always remember is that he says that every man should have the right to the fruit of his own labor. So if you work, you should be paid wages for that, which includes African Americans. But he also does a little bit of race baiting by saying, he is not for interracial marriage, which is at the time what we would today call a kind of dog whistle. He, again, in the early years of his presidency, thinks that we can end slavery, but perhaps we should send Black people out of the United States, and that would heal the nation. He does get over that. And so he eventually, of course, is a supporter of the equality of African Americans as citizens. He sees the end of slavery in the 13th Amendment, but dies before the 14th and 15th Amendments are passed. One other complicated thing with the naming of the school, or the attempt to rename the school in San Francisco, is his role with Native American history, in which he presides over the largest mass execution of, I believe it's 28 members of the Dakota Nation who had been involved in a war with white settlers in Minnesota. 490 white settlers were killed. And so these 28 men are hanged because of that killing. No Confederate who instigated the war or fought in the war is ever executed in such a way. So what I'm saying is that he has a very complicated legacy. Most people of his stature do. There is no political figure, there's no person, including myself, who has a perfect record. And so is it possible to have a school named Lincoln, to have a diverse group of students come into that school, white and non-white, and can they all handle the weight of that history equally in all of its positive and negative? Can we imagine a space where the school is named Lincoln, but not simply as an honorific, but as a balanced attending to the fact that this person, Lincoln, did some amazing things, did some horrible things? Can that be a moment of conversation, of education? That would be my question. Right now, many people are saying it's not possible. We can't hold that complex history. And as an historian, I'm not sure what to do with that, except to, regardless of the name on the building, I want us to talk about the whole history. I think the most important example that Lincoln gives us is of change, and I think we need that in terms of understanding our leaders, in terms of understanding our responsibility to hold our leaders accountable as well. Lots of his change and growth came because those radical abolitionists, black and white, met with him and said, this is not good enough. You need to do more. And we have to do the same thing with our elected leaders. And I think that's a really important lesson to remember.
About the Dakota Nation and the story of the executions, you had it right the first time. It was 38 nooses. And I learned about that last year for the first time when I read a book called 38 Nooses, Lincoln, Little Crow, and the Beginning of the Frontier's End. Speaking of forgotten historical episodes, Tulsa. We just marked the 100th anniversary of that race massacre in 1921 in Tulsa. How does something like that get forgotten?
That is a question historians always ask. How is it possible for a nation to forget such an enormous tragedy? Is the only word really to use. Crime might be another word to use. We estimate, 300 people dead, blocks upon blocks of businesses, homes destroyed, aerial bombing on our own people. And I think that we have to think that there was a concerted effort, desire to forget in terms of the power structure at the time. The permission to do this kind of mass bombing, burning, and lynching, there's no other word for it. This was allowed because of the power structure at the time, the governmental structure. And one of the things that I'm still thinking about in terms of understanding how people understand African-American history and African-Americans' role in this nation is that there's a lot of effort to dismiss the oppression that African-Americans experience. At the same time, people searching for answers to why African-Americans experience lower health rates, have less wealth than other groups, have less education. Moments like this, and this is one of many, this is only the most extreme, but there are many instances in our history where thriving Black institutions, neighborhoods, Black people really trying to live into, if you will, the separate but equal. Okay, we will have our separate neighborhood. We will have our separate businesses, our homes, our neighborhoods. And even in that separation are persecuted, oppressed, burned out of the homes and businesses that they built with the sweat of their own brow. And so that really explains a lot. If repeatedly over generations you have that experience of oppression, it's hard, if not impossible, to continue to pick yourself back up again.
And the importance of generational wealth, right? A community of well-off African Americans in 1921 whose wealth was destroyed. So generations afterward lose out on that.
Exactly. What would have happened if those businesses had continued, had survived down to the 1960s, and then been able to flower even more in the post-civil rights era when we really began to try to dismantle segregation? So forgetting Tulsa removes responsibility from the larger society. And I think there are at least a dozen, if not more, locations where actions like Tulsa happen. Wilmington, North Carolina, another famous instance of using violence to remove African Americans, not only from successful business practices, but also from politics and other successful ways of being.
Let's talk about critical race theory now, CRT. Just about every day I see another story, another headline about banning critical race theory from being taught in schools. What is it? Not what its opponents say it is. What actually is it?
Well, actually, critical race theory, thinking about it, follows very well on what we've just been discussing, because it's an set of ideas developed in the 70s by legal scholars who are really trying to think about how race and racism operates in our society. It's the idea that there are structural elements to racism, that there are ways built into our structures that encourage racism, that encourage disparate outcomes for whites and non-whites. I would think the best example of one of those structures was the Jim Crow era of segregation, where you actually had laws that prevented people from attending schools, not just schools with whites, but schools that were equally equipped. The separate but equal phrase was never followed under Jim Crow segregation. So that's one example of a structure that was built into society. And under critical race theory, particularly at its founding in the 70s, they saw their work as continuing to make sure that those elements of Jim Crow segregation continue to be rooted out. When we talk about critical race theory today, we're partly looking at an historical theory, something that people talk about in the past, but we're also looking at a different way that structural racism can happen. And I would say that another way to think about critical race theory is a set of assumptions that are built into our society that we may not always be aware of, but we're acting upon. And I would also say that this is not only true for whites, but it's true for Blacks and other races, that we are sometimes unaware of the ways in which the way we do things has a racial impact. One common assumption, for example, is that Black people are more disposed to criminality than whites. Now, if I were to say that in any group, you say, oh, that's racist. How could you say that? But we can look at police brutality and the ways that police act towards Black populations to see that they are functioning often on that assumption. This is racial profiling. This is assuming that a man who is in handcuffs on the ground is somehow going to rise up and overturn the police officer who's trying to arrest him. Will somehow, with his hands handcuffed, will seize the gun. These are beliefs about the racial strength, if you will, in a very negative kind of way, of Black men, for example. And so even though people may not consciously think that they are holding quote unquote racist beliefs, they are acting in ways that reveal these kinds of racist beliefs. So one misapprehension about critical race theory is the idea that the people who, the theorists or those who think about it, think that this means that these ideas that people hold about racism are unchangeable. And that is exactly opposite of the truth. The point of thinking about race in a structural way is to look at our structures and think about the ways in which they prevent racial equality. It is not saying that everyone is inherently racist or that racism is, you can't get rid of it. It's saying that there are ways in which it continues and that it changes over time too. So the kind of racism we were dealing with in the 60s and the early 70s when this theory was first put forth, we're dealing with different kinds of things now in the first couple of decades of the 21st century.
Well, you predicted there would be this kind of backlash when you wrote an essay in Politico a couple of years ago about the 1619 Project. So I promised you we would not relitigate 1619 here. I've already done a couple of podcasts about it. You were critical of some of its claims, but you said the backlash against it would turn out to be worse for our understanding of history.
Unfortunately, a lot of people have read the first part of my essay, which was a critique of some of the errors in the 1619 Project, and then they conveniently don't read the second part of my essay, in which I talk about the ways that some of the critics, not all, but a few of the critics, did not take on this question earlier. And I guess one thing that I would say is that some of the errors in the 1619 Project are because some, not all, but some historians ignored this very central contradiction. How does a nation that is calling for freedom and equality of all people still hold on to slavery? And what are we to do about that? And that, I think, led to some of the errors in the 1619 Project. If some of these very good thinkers had really addressed that issue earlier, and made more common cause with some of the historians who were studying slavery. And many of the historians who studied slavery in the 70s and 80s study slavery from the perspective of enslaved people, which is very important. But even I, as an historian, I have a lot of questions about what slavery means in the context of the Revolutionary era and the founding of our country. And I feel like we're still behind on how to understand theories of freedom, along with the fact that the people theorizing freedom continue to hold slaves. So I think that regardless of the backlash against the 1619 Project, many more people, broadly speaking, are going to If they don't read the 1619 Project itself, they will look for works on slavery and on the American Revolution that are more broad, more inclusive of all of the people who were in the nation at that point. And I have received a lot of responses to my essay, and many people want more. They want more history. They want to know, what can I read? How can I explain this? So I was very surprised. I was very nervous about that essay, but the responses I've gotten have been people who want to know more. And that, I think, is the best response we can have.
That's a great point, because I might be framing this as open-minded people on this side fighting the closed-minded people on the other side, when really in the middle there are most of the people who just don't know these things, weren't taught these things. I'm certainly not the most well-educated person either. I didn't know about Tulsa really until recently. So maybe that's a good place to begin wrapping up by focusing on what Danielle Allen, the Harvard scholar, is trying to do: create a civics curriculum that honestly approaches some of these things we've been discussing without surrendering to cynicism.
I think that will be helpful. I wonder, though, if, one of my concerns is there any single possible curriculum that will really bridge the divide we're experiencing now? She's at Harvard. A lot of people right now have a very anti-elite university issue going on, which I don't agree with, but I feel like there are experts in any number of places. So I think, the more curricula, the more assistance we can give to teachers to honestly teach these histories and these complicated ideas, the better. I don't think any single curriculum will do it, but I think we're going to be in struggle a little while about this issue, and of how to teach our history, how to teach it honestly, and how to come to some understanding of the complicated things in our past and in our present.
Well, I'm certainly no elitist, but I think it's safe to say more people have watched Gone with the Wind than have read serious works of scholarship about slavery. I recently watched Gone with the Wind for the first time in a long time. Now, setting aside the historical problems with the movie, it's a little too soap opera-ish for me. I think it's overrated, too much of a soap opera. But, I could see why it's considered a great film. But I have to tell you, especially after everything that's happened in our country over the past year, watching its depictions of slavery and enslaved people in antebellum Southern society, it was cringeworthy. It was cringy.
Who's going to milk that cow, Miss Scarlett? We's house workers.
Quitting time! Who says it's quitting time?
I said it's quitting time.
I was the foreman. I was the one says when it's quitting time of terror. Quitting time!
It's funny, I grew up watching Gone with the Wind. I grew up in New Orleans, but this was national. Every year on one of the national channels, it would be shown. It's this big event. Tonight, Gone with the Wind. And I probably watched it every year that I grew up. And that's not the case anymore, I think, because of the way cable TV works now. We don't have that kind of common experience. But I had a student a couple of years ago who said that in her high school, Gone with the Wind was taught as an historical text.
There you go.
And that was very disturbing, very disturbing. With any of these, I grew up in a household where Gone with the Wind was not the only thing I learned about the Civil War or slavery. I had many other things to choose from. So I could watch Gone with the Wind and have a laugh and look at the clothing and then read actual history books. I think, we're right now in a moment when there are amazing films that have been completed in the last 5 to 10 years or so on slavery. 12 Years a Slave, of course, which is based on a slave narrative, and other works. And so I think we are rounding a corner in terms of even public or popular depictions of slavery. Again, when I look at my 19th century folks, my radical abolitionists, it took them decades to end actual slavery. And change sometimes takes longer than we would like.
Leslie Harris of Northwestern University, thank you for sharing your perspective with us. On the next episode of History as It Happens, is it time for a third party in American politics?
I was not put on the ballot by either of the two parties. I was not put on the ballot by any PAC money, by any foreign lobbyist money, by any special interest money.
Polls show Americans are fed up with Democrats and Republicans, and some Republicans are trying to form an anti-Trump third party. But third parties rarely stick. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.